Welcome to Apex Storyteller, your partner for suspenseful stories. If you enjoy these tales, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. Now settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Late at night, Emma sat in the dim glow of her computer screen, coding away in her usual rhythm. But something was off tonight. Her system was slow. Too slow. She dismissed it as a glitch, but as the hours passed, her programs began behaving strangely. Files opened on their own, messages appeared that she hadn't typed, and then the message that made her freeze. "I'm inside your system now. Are you watching me, Emma?" Emma had always prided herself on being a master of her craft. A hacker by trade, she spent her days working for various high-level tech firms, breaking into systems, solving complex security issues, and navigating a world of firewalls and encryption like it was second nature. She loved the thrill, the rush that came with bypassing security measures that most people would never even dream of getting through. Tonight was no different. She had locked herself in her apartment, a quiet, dimly lit space that was hers and hers alone. The soft hum of her computer was the only sound that filled the room, a constant companion in her world of code. Her task for the night was straightforward: crack into a government server that had been giving her client headaches for weeks. Nothing too difficult for someone of her expertise. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, the hour when she felt most at home in the glow of her computer screen. She was deep into her work, fingers flying over the keyboard, navigating through layers of security with ease. Her focus was razor sharp, her mind a blur of algorithms and firewalls, until a strange noise broke her concentration. It was subtle, almost inaudible, but it was there. A soft clicking like the tap of keys on a keyboard. Emma's eyes darted from the screen to the dark corners of her room. The only light came from the monitor in front of her, casting long shadows across the furniture. She glanced over her shoulder. Nothing. Her breath caught in her throat. Maybe it was just the wind rattling the blinds, or the hum of the refrigerator playing tricks on her ears. She shook her head, trying to shake off the feeling. Still, the noise persisted, now faintly louder, like someone was typing on a keyboard. But it wasn't her. She was alone. With a deep breath, Emma returned her attention to the screen, trying to brush off the unease crawling up her spine. As she resumed typing, a strange flicker appeared on her monitor. The code on her screen jumped, lines shifting in a way she hadn't typed them. She froze. It wasn't a glitch. Someone had accessed her system. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing. How had this happened? She was sure her firewall was up to date, her security measures rock solid. No one should have been able to get in. Yet there it was, proof that something or someone was on the other side of her screen. A new message appeared in the chat window she used to monitor her progress. It was a single line of text. "I see you, Emma." Her heart skipped a beat. The blood drained from her face. It felt like the room was closing in on her. Was this a joke? A prank from one of her hacker friends? No, this felt different. This felt real. Panicked, Emma slammed her fingers onto the keyboard, typing out a quick response. "Who are you?" she typed, her hands shaking as she hit send. The cursor blinked in anticipation, waiting for the response. Emma felt her skin crawl as every second ticked by, the silence growing heavier. Finally the reply came. "You shouldn't have opened that file." Emma's blood ran cold. She hadn't opened any file. The file, whatever it was, had opened itself. It was as though someone was controlling her system remotely. She immediately began disconnecting her internet, hoping to sever the connection, but nothing worked. The screen stayed on, unresponsive to her attempts to log off or shut down the system. The message kept flashing in front of her eyes, the words mocking her as the sound of typing echoed through the room, louder now, as if someone were sitting right behind her, their fingers tapping against the keys. "You're too late, Emma." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't in control anymore. The computer had become something else, something alive, something that was aware of her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave the apartment, but she couldn't. The fear paralyzed her, anchoring her to the chair in front of the screen. Then, without warning, the screen flickered again, this time revealing a new window. It was a live camera feed. At first, it was grainy, hard to make out, but as the image cleared, Emma's blood ran cold. It was a view of her own apartment. The camera angle shifted, and she could see herself sitting at the desk, her face frozen in terror, her fingers gripping the keyboard like a lifeline. And then the camera zoomed in, slowly, inexorably closer to her. Her heart raced as she looked around the room, certain she was alone. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The room had never felt so small, so suffocating. Her phone buzzed on the desk, startling her. She reached for it, her hands trembling. The screen lit up with a single notification from an unknown number. "I'm watching you. You can't escape." The words sent a chill down her spine. Emma's breath quickened and her mind raced. What was going on? Who was doing this? How had they gotten inside her system? And why was this happening to her? The camera feed on her screen zoomed in even closer, now showing her face in sharp detail. It was as though whoever was behind this could see every expression, every flicker of fear that crossed her face. And then, the worst part, the message that followed. "This is just the beginning." The cursor blinked again, the message taunting her, daring her to respond, but Emma could only stare at the screen in horror. She was trapped. Not just in her own apartment, but in the web that was being spun around her. Her safe space, her sanctuary, was no longer hers. It was theirs now. And Emma had no idea who they were. The hours had passed in a blur, but Emma could hardly remember any of them. She was no longer just a hacker at her desk. She was a prisoner, trapped in the confines of her own home. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Her computer screen was the only window to the outside world, but it no longer felt like her own. It felt tainted. And whoever was on the other side of that screen wasn't just a hacker. They were something far worse. The live feed of her apartment still hovered on the screen, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. Whoever was controlling it had full access to her life, her most private moments. They were watching her. But worse, they were in control of everything. Emma's mind raced. How could this be happening? Her skills as a hacker had always made her feel invincible. She had navigated through the most secure systems, evaded the most sophisticated threats. But this was different. This felt personal. This felt like something more than a random cyber attack. And then the message appeared again. "I'm inside your mind now." The blood drained from Emma's face. Her body went cold, her hands trembling as she stared at the screen. It was as if the words were seeping into her thoughts, invading her very consciousness. She slammed her palm against the desk, trying to shake the overwhelming sense of dread that was slowly consuming her. Was it possible that someone was truly inside her head? Had she crossed some line she couldn't come back from? The more she thought about it, the more it felt like the boundaries between her reality and whatever nightmare she was living had begun to blur. The clicking noise was back again, louder this time, like someone typing with frantic urgency. Emma spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. She had checked every corner of the room, but there was no one there. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air heavy with an unseen presence. Her eyes darted back to the screen, but the message was gone. Instead, a new file had appeared on her desktop. It wasn't something she had opened. It wasn't even something she recognized. She hesitated for a moment before clicking it open, her stomach tightening with dread. The file contained a video, a grainy, distorted clip that was only a few seconds long. Her breath caught in her throat as she pressed play. The video was a recording of her own face, but it wasn't from her camera. It was taken from another angle, one that shouldn't have existed. It showed her sitting in her chair, typing, the exact same way she had been moments before. Only this time, her expression was different. It was as though she had no control over it. Her eyes were wide, blank, like she was in a trance. Then the camera zoomed in closer and closer, until her face filled the entire screen. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but the words that came out were not her own. They were chilling, robotic. "You can't escape." Emma's heart stopped. It wasn't possible. She had never recorded that. She had never said those words. But there they were, clear as day, coming from her own lips. The video ended abruptly, leaving her in the darkness of her apartment, shivering with fear. And then the screen went black. Silence. But not for long. The message reappeared as if it had been waiting for her to respond. "I know what you fear most, Emma. And soon you will beg me to stop." Emma's pulse quickened. She had to act fast. The longer she stayed here, the more she felt like she was losing control. But how could she fight something she couldn't even see? She needed answers, but every time she thought she was getting closer to the truth, the situation only deepened in horror. Her phone buzzed on the desk again, the sound making her flinch. She snatched it up, hoping for some sign of help, a message from a friend, anything. But it was more than just a text. It was a video call, from an unknown number. Against her better judgment, Emma answered the call. There on the screen was her own face, not on her camera but on a dark background. The image of her was distorted, like it was coming through a broken, low-resolution connection. She stared at the screen, her breath caught in her throat. The face on the other end stared back at her with an unsettling calmness, a twisted smile creeping across the lips of someone who didn't belong in her life. It was her face, but not her. Somewhere between an eerie imitation and something darker, more dangerous. "Emma, you're still trying to run from me?" The distorted voice came through the phone, making her shiver. It was familiar but wrong. It was as though the voice had been altered, manipulated, something unnatural about it. "I told you. You can't escape." Her hand trembled as she dropped the phone back onto the desk. She stared at it, fighting the overwhelming urge to throw it out the window. The room felt like it was closing in on her. She couldn't breathe. The walls were pressing in, and the weight of the unknown was suffocating. Every flicker of movement, every sound, sent her heart racing. Was she imagining this? Was her mind breaking down under the pressure? Or was there truly something else in the room with her? The clicking sound from behind her had returned. She spun around again, her breath shallow, but the room was empty. There was nothing there. Her eyes darted back to the screen. The message had changed once more. "I can see everything. I know what's in your mind, Emma. All your darkest thoughts, your hidden secrets. You thought you could hide from me, but I've been inside you the whole time." Emma's stomach twisted in knots. The room was silent, but the air felt thick, suffocating. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to leave, to escape, but she knew deep down that running wasn't an option. No matter where she went, they would always be there watching her. The fear began to crawl up her spine, tightening its grip. She was no longer just fighting a hacker. She was fighting something much darker. Something that had no need for codes or passwords. Something that had gotten inside her head. And Emma was beginning to realize it wasn't just watching her. It was controlling her. The night dragged on, and Emma's world had become a maze of fear and paranoia. It felt as though she was living in a nightmare, trapped inside her own home with no escape from the unknown entity that haunted her every move. Every corner she turned, every creak of the floor beneath her feet, sent shivers crawling down her spine. There was no doubt in her mind now, this was not just a hacking incident. This was something far darker, something that wanted her, needed her. The room felt smaller with each passing minute. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional click of her computer, as if the system itself was mocking her, daring her to make a move. Emma's pulse raced, her mind spinning in a dizzying whirl of confusion and fear. How could this be happening? Who was behind this? And why her? The most terrifying part was that she had no answers. And then the whisper started. At first, Emma thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her. She had been awake for far too long, her nerves on edge. But the whispers grew louder, clearer, until they became impossible to ignore. They were soft at first, almost like the rustling of paper, faint and distant, but they quickly became more distinct, like hushed voices, speaking directly to her, just out of reach. She spun around, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, but the room was empty. There was no one there. The whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to surround her, coming from all directions. The voice or voices were familiar, like distant echoes of something she had once known. They were soft, almost gentle, but there was an unmistakable malice in them. Emma? Her name, spoken so softly, yet with such a chilling finality, froze her in place. "You can't hide from me." The air grew thick, suffocating, and Emma's eyes darted to the screen. It was still showing her apartment as it had been for hours now, but something was different. The image was clearer, more vivid, and for a split second, Emma thought she saw movement. But it was only a fleeting shadow. Still, it was enough to send her into a panic. She reached for the keyboard, her fingers shaking as she tried to type something, anything, that could help her break free. But before she could press a key, the screen flickered again, and the word she had typed disappeared, replaced by a new message. "You're not alone, Emma. We're inside you now." Emma's heart hammered in her chest, her skin crawling as the words seemed to seep into her very being. It felt like a violation, like something had breached the deepest parts of her mind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Emma struggled to focus. She had to figure out what was happening. There had to be an explanation. But as she sat there, her body tense and her mind racing, the shadows in the corners of the room began to move. At first, it was just a flicker at the edge of her vision, a slight shift in the darkness. But then, as if responding to her growing panic, the shadows began to stretch and twist, becoming something more than just absence. The room, once so familiar, began to distort. The shadows grew darker, deeper, and began to take shape, shapes that didn't belong, shapes that shouldn't exist. Emma's breath caught in her throat as one of the shadows seemed to detach itself from the wall. It slithered across the floor, an unnatural liquid movement that defied everything she knew about the world. It was coming closer and she could feel it, creeping toward her like a predator. The whispers grew louder, closer, more urgent. "We're watching you, Emma. We know everything about you." She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. But the shadows followed like they had a mind of their own. They twisted and contorted, getting closer and closer with every passing second. She backed away, her heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The walls felt like they were closing in. Suddenly, the screen flickered again, but this time the words were different. They were no longer just taunting her, they were threatening her. "You think you can run? You think you can hide?" The air in the room turned cold, so cold that Emma could see her breath, her exhale forming a cloud in the chill. The shadows had enveloped the room, wrapping themselves around her like a living thing. She could no longer tell where the darkness ended and the shadows began. It was as if the entire room had become a single, suffocating entity. She could feel something cold brushing against her skin. A hand? A touch? She didn't know. All she knew was that it wasn't real. It couldn't be. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But then she heard it, a low, guttural growl that came from somewhere deep within the shadows. The sound of something alive, something monstrous, something hungry. "Run, Emma, run while you still can." The words were whispered, but they were clear. And the growl grew louder, a monstrous sound that shook her to the core. She turned, desperately scrambling toward the door, but as her hand reached for the handle, it snapped shut with a violent force as if someone, or something, had locked it from the other side. Her breath came in panicked gasps as she looked around for another way out, but the shadows had surrounded her, leaving no escape. The growl continued, the sound of something waiting, watching, and hungering for her. And then, from the corner of the room, she saw it. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, moving slowly toward her. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body shrouded in the inky blackness of the shadows. Its eyes glowed with a faint, sinister light, and as it stepped closer, Emma could see the twisted smile on its face. "You shouldn't have come here, Emma. You should have stayed away." She screamed, her voice breaking the silence, but the sound was swallowed up by the room. The figure moved closer, its shadow reaching out like a claw, ready to grab her, to pull her into the darkness. But before it could reach her, the screen flickered once more, the image of her apartment disappearing entirely. In its place was a new message, one that made her blood run cold. "This is just the beginning, Emma. You're ours now." And then the shadows closed in. Emma's mind raced as she struggled to process the nightmare unfolding before her eyes. The cold, oppressive darkness of the room seemed to press in on her from every direction. Her chest tightened with each labored breath. She felt the weight of something heavy, unseen, creeping closer with every passing moment. It was as if the shadows were alive, crawling along the walls, the ceiling, and beneath the floorboards, filling every inch of the room with their twisted, suffocating presence. Her heart was pounding in her chest, deafening in its frantic rhythm. She could hear nothing but the blood rushing in her ears and the soft, guttural growls that echoed from the corners of the room. The whispers were gone now, but the weight of their silence was worse. It was like they were waiting for something, waiting for her to make a mistake. Her eyes darted back to the screen, the place where the terrifying figure had once stood. It was gone, but the words remained. "This is just the beginning, Emma. You're ours now." The cold air around her thickened, freezing the very breath in her lungs. Emma stumbled backward, her limbs heavy, like her body was being weighed down by the invisible force that had taken hold of the room. She turned, looking for any way out, but the door was still locked, and the shadows had shifted again, swarming, closing in. She could feel them around her, pressing against her skin like fingers brushing against her body. Her fingers brushed against the back of her chair, and she gripped it tightly, trying to steady herself. The computer screen flickered again, and for a moment she thought she saw something. A fleeting shape, a distorted figure standing just behind her reflection. But when she turned, there was nothing. Nothing except the suffocating dark that consumed the corners of the room. "Emma?" The whisper was back, softer this time. Almost comforting, like a lullaby sung by something sinister. "You can't hide from me." Her skin crawled, her stomach lurching in terror as the voice seemed to move around her. It wasn't coming from just one place anymore. It was everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air was alive with it. Suddenly, something tugged at the hem of her shirt, pulling her toward the shadows at the far end of the room. It was an unseen hand grabbing at her, dragging her deeper into the darkness. She screamed, her voice a raw, desperate cry for help that was swallowed up by the void. No one could hear her. No one was coming to save her. She tried to break free, but the invisible force was too strong. It yanked her forward, sending her crashing into the desk. The computer screen flickered once more, the image of her apartment twisting and warping into something grotesque. The walls seemed to stretch, the furniture contorting into monstrous shapes, as though the very room itself was being warped by the darkness that had taken over. A flash of light shot from the screen, blinding Emma for a moment. She recoiled, shielding her eyes, but when she opened them again, the room had changed. The shadows had taken on a life of their own, swirling around her like smoke. The once familiar walls of her apartment now felt foreign, alien, as though they had been replaced with a strange, twisted version of reality. Then she saw it. The figure. It was standing in the corner of the room, its tall, twisted form barely visible in the flickering light. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a dark hood, but she could feel its eyes on her. The way they pierced her soul, cold and calculating. The creature didn't move at first. It just stood there watching her, waiting for something. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the figure's lips curled into a sickening smile, one that sent a wave of nausea through her body. The shadows around it seemed to stretch and move, as if they were an extension of the figure itself. It was the embodiment of darkness, of everything she feared, and it was closer now, closing in on her every second. "You're not in control anymore, Emma," the figure said, its voice a chilling whisper that echoed in the depths of her mind. "You never were." Emma's mind was spinning. How could this be happening? How could a simple hacking job turn into something so monstrous? It was as if this thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for her to unlock something. The screen flickered again and a new message appeared. "You should have stopped, Emma. You should have shut it down. Now it's too late." The room around her trembled as though the very foundation of her apartment was cracking beneath her feet. The shadows in the corners of the room grew longer, twisting like serpents. They stretched out, snaking toward her with an unnatural, predatory speed. She could feel them crawling up her legs, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her down, binding her to the ground. Her heart raced in her chest as she tried to scream again, but the words wouldn't come. Her mouth felt dry, her throat constricted, as if the very air in the room had turned to lead. She was suffocating, trapped in this hellish nightmare. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure moved. It was fast, too fast, its form a blur as it crossed the room and was suddenly right in front of her, standing so close that she could feel its icy breath against her face. Its fingers, long and thin like brittle twigs, reached out to touch her cheek, and she flinched at the coldness of its touch. "You're mine now," the figure whispered, its voice like a dagger to her soul. "I told you, Emma. You can never escape me." Emma's mind screamed, but her body wouldn't respond. The shadows around her tightened their grip, pulling her deeper into their darkness. It felt like the very walls of her apartment were closing in on her, suffocating her, consuming her. And just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the screen flickered once more and a final message appeared. "You can't hide from the darkness, Emma. It's inside you now. Forever." The room plunged into complete darkness, and Emma felt herself falling into an endless void as though the world itself had crumbled beneath her. Her scream echoed, but it was swallowed by the abyss. And then, everything went silent. The silence that engulfed Emma was suffocating, a void that felt colder than the deepest winter night. She floated, or rather, she felt as though she was being pulled, drawn deeper into the black abyss that had consumed her world. Every ounce of her being screamed for her to wake up, to escape, but there was nothing. No sensation of movement, no light, only a cold, empty darkness that wrapped around her like a shroud. Then out of the silence there came a faint sound, a low hum. It was barely perceptible, like the whir of an old computer, the kind you only hear in the quiet moments when the world stills. But this sound was different. It was the hum of something ancient, something unnatural. It grew louder, reverberating through her body, shaking her very core. It felt as though the hum was coming from inside her, like her very bones were vibrating in sync with the noise. Suddenly, the darkness began to shift. The void that had once been so absolute, so complete, seemed to distort, as if reality itself was bending. Shadows, blacker than night, began to take shape. They coalesced, forming shapes that were half-remembered nightmares, fleeting glimpses of monstrous figures that twisted and writhed before her eyes. Emma's heart hammered in her chest, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't move. Her limbs felt frozen, stiff, as though bound by an invisible force that held her in place. Then she saw them. The figures emerged from the darkness, their forms slowly becoming more solid, more distinct. Tall and gaunt, their limbs twisted and contorted in unnatural angles. Their faces were pale, featureless masks, except for the eyes. The eyes were wide, hollow pits that stared into her very soul, black as the void that surrounded them. They didn't move like normal beings. No, they slithered like creatures from another dimension. They didn't walk, they glided as though they were both part of the darkness and yet separate from it. They were all around her, closing in, the walls of the abyss narrowing with each passing second. Emma's body trembled, paralyzed with fear. What were these things? Were they real? She tried to scream, to shout, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness, lost before it even reached her lips. Then one of the figures stepped forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and the sound of its presence, the soft rustling of fabric or skin, the slight creak of bones shifting in the dark, was deafening. It stopped just in front of her, its face mere inches from hers. She could feel its breath, cold and damp against her skin, and she shuddered in horror. But it was the eyes that held her captive. Those empty, black holes that seemed to pierce right through her, searching, probing. "You thought you could escape, Emma," the figure whispered, its voice low and guttural, as though it was made from the very darkness itself. "But you never left. You've been with us all along." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. What did it mean? How could this be happening? She had been in her apartment, hacking in peace, and now she was trapped in this nightmare with these things. She felt as though her mind was being pulled apart, unraveling at the seams as the truth she didn't want to face began to sink in. "You're ours now," the figure continued, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "Every decision you've made, every click, every line of code has led you here. You're part of us, Emma. Forever." A wave of nausea washed over her, and she tried to look away to escape those eyes. But they followed her, relentless, consuming. The more she resisted, the more they grew, until her entire vision was filled with those black pits, those soulless, empty eyes. The darkness began to swirl around her, closing in, pressing in on her chest. Her breaths came faster now, frantic, shallow, as if the very air had been stolen from her lungs. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape. It was as if the darkness was crushing her from all sides, suffocating her, driving her mad with its pressure. "Emma," the figure's voice was now a growl, its tone mocking, "don't you see? There is no escape. You opened the door and now you must walk through it. This is your world now. The rules have changed. You are part of the system, and the system never forgets. You are ours." Emma's mind reeled. Was this real? Was she losing her grip on reality? It felt like she was drowning in this abyss, her thoughts slipping away like sand through her fingers. But then, through the overwhelming terror, through the suffocating darkness, a single thought broke through. The computer. The screen. The reason she was here, the reason this was happening, it had all started with the hacking. She had accessed something she wasn't meant to, and now the system had found her. It had taken hold of her, and there was no going back. But what if there was a way out? What if there was something she could do? Could she reverse it, undo the damage she had caused? Was there any hope? Her eyes darted around the abyss, looking for some sign of the screen, the machine that had started it all. Her fingers twitched, and for the briefest moment she thought she could feel the cool, familiar surface of the keyboard beneath her fingertips. Was it real? Or was it just another illusion, another cruel trick played by the dark forces surrounding her? The figure's grip on her tightened, its hands, long gnarled like claws, wrapped around her throat, squeezing just enough to make her vision blur. But even through the suffocating pain, the thought persisted. The only way to escape was to confront it, to find the source of the nightmare. It wasn't just the darkness that she had to face. It was the machine, the code, the very thing she had brought to life. "Find it, Emma," the figure hissed, its face inches from hers. "Find the truth and know that once you do, you will never be the same. You will be us." The room began to spin, the shadows closing in tighter, the darkness pressing against her chest. She had no choice. She had to fight. She had to face it. The clock was ticking, and whatever she had unleashed was coming for her. But could she stop it? Could she even survive this nightmare? With one final, desperate breath, Emma reached for the light, for the one thing that could save her. The screen. The code. The truth. Emma's mind was racing, heart pounding in her chest as the darkness pressed in on all sides. The figures, their hollow eyes locked on her, seemed to grow in size and menace, their shadowy forms stretching farther into the abyss. The cold air around her was thick with the stench of decay and old electronics. Her body was numb from the weight of the terror that consumed her, but one thought pierced through the chaos: the code, the machine. If she could just find it again, she could reverse what had been set into motion. But how? The figure holding her throat laughed, a cruel, guttural sound that echoed through the void. It was like nails on a chalkboard, scraping across her mind, grinding away at the last remnants of her sanity. "Did you really think you could escape?" the creature whispered, its voice now a low, mocking growl. "You opened the door, Emma. You let us in. And now there's no way out. You're part of the system, part of us. Forever." But Emma couldn't afford to listen. She couldn't afford to give in to the suffocating fear that threatened to swallow her whole. Her fingers twitched again, and for a split second, she thought she could feel the faintest vibration in the air. A hum. A low, mechanical whir, almost like the sound of a computer booting up. A surge of hope coursed through her, and with a strength she didn't know she had, she yanked her arm free from the creature's grasp. It was a feeble motion, weak and desperate, but it was enough to send the figure reeling back. It hissed in anger, but Emma didn't waste time. She had to move, had to find the machine, had to find the code. She stumbled through the darkness, her steps shaky but determined. The air around her seemed to grow colder with each movement, as though the very atmosphere was fighting against her. The shadows loomed, watching, waiting, but Emma refused to stop. Every step was a battle against the crushing weight of fear, against the unnatural pull that threatened to drag her under. Then, out of the blackness, she saw it. A faint glow. It was so small, so distant, but it was enough. Her heart skipped a beat. It was the screen, the very screen she had been working on. The computer. The code. It was real. It had to be. She rushed toward the light, her mind buzzing with questions, with fear, but also with a newfound sense of urgency. What if the screen wasn't just a way to reverse everything? What if it was the key to understanding what had happened to her? What if it held the answers that could save her, or doom her forever? The closer she got, the more the darkness seemed to fight back. The shadows stretched out, reaching for her, trying to pull her back into the abyss. But Emma couldn't stop now. She had to reach it. With trembling hands, she grasped the edge of the screen. The moment her fingers made contact, the glow intensified, blinding her for a split second. She squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The code was there, lines of numbers and symbols running across the screen like a river of information. It was familiar, yet foreign. A language she had once known, but now seemed alien, strange, and twisted. But then the code began to change. It wasn't just random characters and symbols anymore. It was alive. The lines of code began to shift and rearrange, forming words, sentences, and commands that she couldn't understand. They were too cryptic, too complicated. But one thing became clear. The machine was communicating with her. It was talking to her, telling her something. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized what was happening. The code was feeding off her fear. It was adapting, evolving, becoming more powerful with each passing second. The very machine that had once been her tool, her escape, was now controlling her. It was pulling her in, consuming her thoughts, manipulating her every move. She wasn't hacking it anymore, it was hacking her. The figure from the darkness appeared again, but this time it wasn't alone. More of them had emerged, their forms more defined, more corporeal. They surrounded her, their hollow eyes locked on the screen, their mouths twisted into sinister grins. "You thought you could control it," one of them said, its voice like broken glass. "But you were always the one being controlled. You're just another line of code in the system now, Emma. And the system never forgets." Emma tried to back away, but the shadows closed in, pressing against her, suffocating her. The cold was unbearable, a freezing wind that cut through her skin, biting at her very soul. She could feel the machine's presence all around her now, wrapping its cold, digital tendrils around her mind, her body. There was no escaping it, no way out. But then, something in her snapped. No, she wasn't going to let this machine take her. She had fought too hard, survived too much to give up now. Emma's eyes darted back to the screen. There was a command there, buried deep within the code. It was a string of symbols, barely visible, like a hidden message left just for her. With shaky fingers, she reached out, her hand trembling as she typed the command. The machine fought back, trying to stop her, but Emma didn't care. She had to finish it. She had to stop this. Her fingers hit the final key, and for a brief moment, everything went still. Then the room exploded with noise. The screen flickered, the code flashing faster than her eyes could follow. The shadows around her screamed, their voices a cacophony of terror, as if the machine was alive, screaming in agony. The air thickened, the pressure mounting with every passing second. Emma felt as if she were being pulled apart. Her mind, her body, everything was breaking down. But she held on. She couldn't stop now. She had to hold on. The code had been altered. The system had been changed. Emma had rewritten the rules, and just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The noise, the pressure, the darkness, it was all gone. Emma collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her chest heaving. The shadows had vanished. The figures were gone. And the screen, her computer, was dark, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. For a moment, Emma thought it was all over. She thought she had won. But as she looked around, something caught her eye. A flicker, a movement in the corner of the room. It was faint but unmistakable. A shadow, a figure, and it was getting closer. Emma's heart raced again, the dread creeping back in, clawing at her mind. She wasn't free. Not yet. Emma's breath was shallow, her chest rising and falling in rapid succession as she watched the figure in the corner of the room. It was cloaked in darkness, but even in the dim light, its presence was undeniable. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closing in, pressing against her as if the space itself was suffocating her. The shadows, which had once been her prison, were now her tormentors. They twisted and writhed around her, forming shapes, faces, eyes, everything and nothing at once. She couldn't move. Her limbs were paralyzed with fear. The cold had returned, this time sharper, more biting, like 1,000 invisible needles pressing into her skin. Emma could feel the hair on the back of her neck stand up, each nerve ending tingling, screaming at her to run, to escape, but her feet remained frozen. The room felt like a cage now, every corner a reminder that she was trapped, and the darkness was closing in. The figure in the corner shifted. It took a step forward, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. The coldness increased, suffocating her, and she could see the faint outline of its form, a tall, looming silhouette, its features hidden in the blackness. She could feel its eyes on her, even though she couldn't see them. The air grew heavier, oppressive, as if the very space was being filled with an unseen weight, crushing her. The screen in front of her flickered back to life, and for the first time since the horror had begun, Emma's heart raced in a different way. She was no longer sure if she had won. The machine, the code, had been altered, but now it seemed like it was feeding off her terror. The screen was no longer just a source of information, it was a portal. A portal that had opened the door to something worse, something far darker than she had ever imagined. The figure took another step forward, closer now. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as she finally managed to pull herself to her feet, each movement slow and deliberate, like she was fighting against the weight of the world. The figure's presence was suffocating, but she had to do something. She couldn't just stand there and wait for it to consume her. And then she saw it. On the screen, the code had shifted again. This time, the words that formed on the display were clear, distinct. They weren't cryptic symbols or commands. No, this was different. This was something else, something far more terrifying. Red, the game is over. You are the final piece. You are the one we've been waiting for. Her blood ran cold. The words echoed in her mind, each syllable reverberating louder and louder, until they felt like they were inside her skull, pushing against her thoughts. The figure in the corner didn't move, but Emma could feel it now. It wasn't just a shadow. It was alive. It was watching her. Waiting. The air shifted again. A low hum, almost imperceptible, filled the room, like the sound of machinery deep within the walls, the hum of a machine that had been dormant, waiting for its moment to wake. Emma's mind was racing, but there was a single thought that cut through the chaos. The code. The system. She was a part of it now. The screen flickered again, the code changing faster than her eyes could follow. A new line of text appeared. No, it wasn't just text. It was a command, a directive. Emma's hands moved on their own, almost as if controlled by some outside force, her fingers flying across the keyboard, typing out the command that had appeared on the screen. Do you think you can stop it? She froze. The words felt like they were written just for her, mocking her, taunting her with her own helplessness. The figure moved again, its shape becoming clearer, the darkness around it bleeding into something tangible, something real. Its face, Emma could see it now, was obscured, but there were eyes. Eyes that glowed, not with light, but with something darker, something alive. And then it spoke. You think you can control the code? You think you can rewrite reality? Its voice rasped, harsh and guttural, like 1,000 voices whispering from the deep. There is no stopping us. There is no escape. You belong to us now. Emma's pulse raced. She tried to stand, but her knees buckled beneath her. The screen was flashing rapidly now, like an emergency warning, and in her mind, a voice echoed, a cold, commanding voice that wasn't her own. You are the final piece. The system has chosen you. The figure took another step closer, and this time, Emma didn't hesitate. She bolted, running toward the door, toward any chance of escape, but the room seemed to shift with her, stretching and bending like it was made of liquid. The walls closed in and the shadows followed her, like a pack of hungry wolves circling their prey. She was running, but the room was changing, warping, as if it had a life of its own. The figure's laugh echoed behind her, filling her ears, drowning out everything else. She could feel it now, its presence pressing down on her, suffocating her every breath. There was no escape. She reached the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but it felt locked from the inside, the mechanism refusing to budge. She hammered on it, her fists slamming against the wood, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold was everywhere now, chilling her to the bone, creeping into her very soul. And then, just as she was about to give up, a single word appeared on the screen. Run. The screen flickered again, the code shifting one final time. Emma's eyes widened in realization as the room began to collapse in on itself, the walls twisting, the shadows closing in. She turned and ran once more, the figure now right behind her, its glowing eyes burning into her back. She could feel its breath, cold and unnatural, on her neck, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't slow down. The last thing Emma heard before the darkness swallowed her whole was the sound of the machine, the hum of the code, growing louder and louder, until it drowned out everything else. And then silence. Emma's fate? It was sealed. Not by her own hand, but by the hand of the very system she had tried to control. The code had been rewritten. The game was over. But the system never truly stops. It waits, and it always finds a way back. Two girls, alone in a small town, with no one to rely on but each other. They thought they could handle the isolation, but the town wasn't as empty as they believed. At night, strange noises echo from the woods and whispers come from the walls. Could it be just their imaginations? Or is something far darker watching them? The real question is, what's lurking just outside their door, waiting to be invited in? Lena and Sophie had always dreamt of escaping the chaos of city life. Tired of crowded streets and the constant noise, they had found the perfect place. A small, quiet town on the edge of nowhere. It seemed like paradise, or at least it did at first. The houses were scattered across the hills, tucked between thick woods, and the air was fresh, untainted by pollution. It was peaceful, too peaceful almost. They moved into a small cottage just outside of town, a modest place with creaky floors, old wooden beams, and a fireplace that seemed to have been untouched for years. But despite its age, there was something charming about it. It felt like the perfect retreat from the world. The neighbors were friendly but distant, and after a few brief encounters, Lena and Sophie were left to their own devices. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal, almost too normal. The kind of quiet that made you question if something was hiding just beneath the surface. It started subtly at first. Little things. Lena would hear a creak in the floorboards when she was alone in the living room, but Sophie would be right there and she'd never hear it. Then it was a soft whisper late at night, just barely audible. Sophie would wake up with a start, thinking she had heard someone calling her name, but when she looked around, the room was empty. "It's just your imagination," Lena would say, trying to reassure her, but Sophie wasn't convinced. One evening, the air was particularly still. The wind hadn't picked up and the streets were deserted. Lena was curled up on the couch, reading a book, while Sophie was in the kitchen making dinner. The house was eerily quiet, and the silence felt almost unnatural, like the world outside had simply stopped moving. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the front door. It was sharp, deliberate, too loud for such a quiet town. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. The town's residents weren't known for their late-night visits, and it was nearly midnight. She rose cautiously from the couch, her footsteps muffled against the creaky wood floor. She peered through the living room window but saw nothing. No cars in the driveway, no figures standing in the moonlight. Just the dark outline of the trees lining the property. The knock came again, this time even louder. Lena's pulse quickened, and her fingers trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Opening it slowly, she found nothing on the porch. But there, in the center of the welcome mat, lay a folded piece of paper. Lena bent down to pick it up, her hands shaking slightly. The paper was old, yellowed with age, the edges curled like it had been there for far longer than it seemed. She unfolded it carefully, almost afraid to read what it might say. The handwriting was messy, hurried. "Leave before it's too late." The word sent a jolt of fear through Lena's chest. She glanced nervously around the porch, but there was no one. No sign of who had left the note. She stepped back inside, locking the door behind her. Sophie, who had heard Lena's footsteps and the knock, came into the living room with a concerned expression. Who was it? Lena held the note out to her, her voice trembling slightly. There was no one there. Sophie took the note, her brow furrowing as she read the words. What does this mean? Who would leave a note like that? I don't know, Lena replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't think we're alone here. Not really. For the rest of the night, the two of them sat in silence, both too afraid to speak. They heard it again, so faint it was almost imperceptible, the softest of whispers like someone was talking just beyond the walls. Lena turned to Sophie, her face pale. Did you hear that? Sophie nodded, her eyes wide with fear. What is that? The house was quiet again. But the whispers continued, faint at first, then growing louder. They came from the walls, from the ceiling, from everywhere. Lena jumped to her feet, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but there was no logical explanation. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. Sophie looked around, her eyes darting to the corners of the living room. The shadows seemed to move as if they were alive. Her heart raced as she tried to make sense of it all. This place, it's not right. Lena swallowed hard, her breath coming in quick bursts. We need to leave. We can't stay here. Not after. Another loud knock at the door. But this time the sound wasn't just a knock. It was a bang. A violent, earth-shaking slam that made the entire house rattle. Lena and Sophie froze in place, staring at each other, their faces pale in the dim light. Who is it? Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Lena didn't answer. She couldn't. She was too afraid to even move. They both crept toward the door, peeking through the curtains. No one. The driveway was empty. The street was silent. The woods beyond the house seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. But as they watched, a shadow moved through the trees. Slowly, deliberately. It was not an animal. And it was not a person. Lena could feel the cold sweat running down her spine. We need to leave, Sophie. Right now. But Sophie was frozen, her eyes fixed on the figure moving through the trees. She couldn't look away. She couldn't tear her gaze from the darkness. Lena, do you see that? Lena did. And what she saw made her heart stop. The shadow was getting closer. Lena and Sophie didn't speak for what felt like hours after the shadow had passed through the trees. They remained locked in place, staring through the curtains at the empty street below, their breath shallow and quick. The knock on the door, the whispers, the shadow, it was all too much. The strange sensation that something, or someone, was watching them wouldn't go away. I think we should go, Sophie finally whispered, her voice barely a sound. We can't stay here. Not with all this happening. Lena didn't answer immediately. Her mind raced, trying to process everything. Could it just be paranoia? Could they really be overreacting? The shadows, the knock, the whispers, they didn't make sense. But neither did the feeling in her gut. Something was wrong, something deeper than she could explain. Sophie grabbed her coat, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. Lena, please, let's leave. Just for the night. We'll come back tomorrow, figure this out. Lena glanced out the window one last time, scanning the road. Everything was still. The town, the woods, it all looked too peaceful. Too quiet. It almost felt as though the world was holding its breath. I'm not sure, Lena began, but she was interrupted by another soft knock on the door. Both girls froze. It wasn't a bang this time. It was quieter, almost tentative, as though someone was trying not to be heard. Did you hear that? Sophie whispered urgently. Lena nodded, her throat tight. She didn't want to move. She didn't want to open that door again, but she couldn't ignore the urge pulling her toward it. Slowly, cautiously, she crept toward the door, heart pounding in her chest. Sophie followed close behind, her eyes wide with fear, her hand clutching Lena's sleeve. Lena reached for the doorknob and paused, taking a deep breath. She had to know. If they were to leave, they had to know what was happening. With a shaky hand, she opened the door just a crack. Nothing. The porch was empty, but the air felt different, heavy. The temperature had dropped, and the hairs on the back of Lena's neck stood on end. There was no note this time. No sound. Only a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Lena stepped outside, her feet crunching softly on the gravel path that led to the road. She glanced at the trees, the dark figures looming in the distance, their shapes barely visible in the dim moonlight. Something in the woods had been there, she was sure of it. But there was no sign of movement now. The shadows seemed to breathe, like they were alive, shifting in ways that didn't seem natural. I don't like this, Sophie muttered, clutching Lena's arm. It feels like we're being watched. And I swear I heard someone out there. Lena felt the same way. The sense of unease was overwhelming, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn deeper into something they didn't understand. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound filled the air. It was faint at first, like an animal growling, but it was coming from somewhere deep in the woods. The growl wasn't animalistic. It was something else. It was the sound of something ancient, something primal. Lena's heart skipped a beat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Sophie nodded, her face pale. "What was that?" Before Lena could respond, the sound came again. Louder this time. It was followed by a strange rustling sound, like something large was moving through the underbrush, but there was no wind. Nothing. Just the eerie rustling that sent chills down their spines. Lena backed away from the door, motioning for Sophie to follow her inside. "We need to stay inside," she said, her voice shaking. "We shouldn't be out here." Sophie didn't need to be told twice. She hurried inside, and Lena slammed the door shut behind them, locking it quickly. The house felt suffocating, the walls pressing in on them as if they were closing in. But then the whispering started again. Only this time it wasn't just from the walls. It was coming from all around them. Faint, like the voices were carried on the wind, but unmistakable. It was as if the very air was thick with it. Lena strained to listen, but she couldn't make out the words. They were too distant, too faint, but they felt deliberate, calculating. Lena and Sophie exchanged nervous glances, their faces pale. "Where is that coming from?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. The two girls crept toward the source of the whispers, which seemed to be coming from the kitchen. Lena grabbed Sophie's hand, pulling her closer. "It's just the house settling," she tried to convince herself, but even she didn't believe it. They reached the kitchen doorway and stopped short. The door to the basement was open. Lena didn't remember opening it. Neither of them had touched it. They had both been in the living room earlier, and the basement had been locked. The door stood ajar, a dark abyss beyond. The air grew heavier, thick with tension. The whispers seemed louder now, and they were definitely coming from below. Something was down there. "I don't want to go down there," Sophie said, her voice trembling. What if it's something else?" Lena swallowed hard, her throat dry. She couldn't explain it, but the pull toward the basement was undeniable. She had to know what was down there. "We have to go," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Sophie hesitated. "No, Lena. We can't. Something's wrong. I can feel it. I don't want to." But Lena was already walking toward the basement stairs. She couldn't help herself. It was like a compulsion. A need to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. She descended slowly, Sophie reluctantly following her. The air grew colder the further they went, the whispers growing louder, clearer. "Leave? You shouldn't be here. It's too late." Lena's pulse quickened. She could see the flickering light of the basement below her, a dim glow casting strange shadows against the walls. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, like they were right behind her, urging her to turn back. But she pressed on, stepping cautiously into the basement. Then she saw it. There, in the center of the room, was a large old mirror. It wasn't there the last time she had checked. The mirror reflected nothing but darkness. But the whispers, no, the voices, were louder now. She could hear them more clearly. Look at yourself." The hairs on her neck stood on end as she moved closer to the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. Her face was distorted, almost twisted. It wasn't her. It was someone or something else. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. The basement door slammed shut behind them, the sound so deafening that it felt like the house itself had exhaled a heavy breath. Sophie yelped and pressed herself against the cold wall, her hand trembling as it reached for Lena's arm. But Lena barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the mirror. The reflection wasn't hers. It was a distorted, contorted version of herself, twisted beyond recognition. Her skin seemed to ripple, her eyes unnaturally wide, as though something was trying to break through from the other side. Sophie gasped, pulling Lena back. "Lena, get away from it. It's not you, it's not you." Lena couldn't tear her gaze away. Something in her chest clenched, a feeling that was both familiar and foreign, like an old memory tugging at her brain but refusing to reveal itself. She reached out towards the mirror, her hand shaking. The moment her fingertips brushed the glass, the air around them seemed to grow heavier. The temperature in the room dropped, and the whispers, those faint eerie whispers, grew louder, as though they were screaming now, not from behind her, but from within the mirror itself. She's coming for you?" Lena's heart raced, her mind clouded with terror and confusion. The reflection in the mirror began to twitch, jerking unnaturally, like a puppet on strings. For a split second, Lena thought she saw the image of a woman standing behind her, tall, shadowed, with eyes that gleamed a haunting, unnatural shade of yellow. But when she spun around, no one was there. Sophie screamed. "Lena, we have to leave now." But Lena couldn't move. Her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The reflection in the mirror, it wasn't just her face anymore. It was something else. Something much darker. The reflection of Lena smiled back at her with a sinister grin, and behind that grin was something far worse. "Come to me?" The voice, low, hoarse, and dripping with malice, spoke from the mirror. But it wasn't Lena's voice. It was deeper, filled with an unnatural resonance. The reflection of Lena raised a hand, and Lena felt a sharp, inexplicable pull. The feeling was as if the mirror itself were calling to her, trying to drag her in. Sophie grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her. "Lena, snap out of it. We need to get out of here." But Lena couldn't hear her. The whispers were all-consuming now. They filled the basement, swirling around her like an oppressive storm. The reflection in the mirror began to move on its own, the twisted image of Lena stepping forward, its hand reaching out as if to break through the glass. Sophie backed away, her eyes wide with panic. "Lena, listen to me. We need to." Before she could finish her sentence, the basement lights flickered violently, plunging the room into an almost total darkness. The faint, eerie glow from the mirror was the only thing that illuminated the space, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Then the sound came. A soft, distant scraping noise. It was coming from the walls, from the corners, from the ceiling. It was as though the house itself was alive, shifting and groaning under some invisible weight. Lena still stood frozen in front of the mirror, her reflection moving in ways she couldn't understand. The image of herself was no longer just a reflection. It was becoming something else, something darker. The mirror seemed to pulse as though it were breathing. Its edges began to blur, distorting further, the glass melting into blackness. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed from deep within the walls, vibrating through the floor. The house shook, sending dust and debris falling from the ceiling. A chilling breeze rushed through the basement, as though something large had just passed by, but there was no visible source. Sophie shouted, "Lena, run!" But it was too late. The mirror flickered one last time, and in a split second, the distorted reflection reached out, its hand emerging from the glass, grabbing Lena's wrist with an iron grip. The coldness of it seeped through her skin, the sensation like icy tendrils burrowing under her flesh. Lena screamed in horror, struggling to break free, but the grip tightened, pulling her closer to the glass. Sophie screamed for help, but there was no one to hear. The room around them seemed to warp, the walls breathing in and out as if they were alive. The whispers, the growling, the scratching sounds, everything intensified. The basement was no longer just a basement. It felt like it was part of something bigger, something older, something far more dangerous. Lena's heart raced. She was being pulled inch by inch into the mirror. The reflection was no longer a distorted version of her. It was the dark figure that had been in the woods earlier. It had found her. Sophie rushed forward, grabbing Lena by the waist and pulling her with all her strength. "Let go. Let go of her," she screamed, but the reflection only grinned wider, its face now taking on a more monstrous shape, its eyes glowing with malice. With one final, desperate yank, Sophie managed to pull Lena free from the mirror's grasp. Lena stumbled backward, gasping for air, her chest heaving. The room returned to its eerie stillness, the mirror's surface now just a plain reflection again. But the whispers hadn't stopped. They were still there, swirling around them, filling the space like an invisible storm. And then, from the corner of the basement, Lena noticed something else. There, in the shadows, stood a figure. It was tall, hunched, with a face that she couldn't fully make out, but the eyes were glowing faintly, just like the reflection in the mirror. The figure stepped forward, its long, thin fingers reaching out toward them. Sophie gasped. "Lena, what is that? What is that thing?" Lena couldn't answer. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure, the twisted thing that had appeared from the darkness. They were not alone anymore, and whatever had been waiting for them in the mirror was now in their world. With a slow, deliberate motion, the figure stepped closer, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. The cold wasn't just the chill of the basement anymore. It was the cold of something ancient, something hungry. Lena and Sophie backed away, both knowing deep down that running might not even help. There was no escape from this thing. "You can't escape, you never could." The voice wasn't from the figure. It came from the walls, from the mirror, from everywhere. And just before the figure lunged forward, Lena whispered to Sophie, "We need to find a way to stop it. But we don't have much time." The figure grinned, its eyes glowing brighter as it moved toward them, its footsteps slow and measured. And then, with a bone-chilling laugh, the darkness closed in. The room was suffocating, the walls pressing in on them from all sides. Lena and Sophie stood frozen, their eyes locked on the figure in the corner of the basement. Its form was tall and obscured by shadows, but its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, watching them with a cruel, calculating gaze. Sophie's breath came in sharp gasps, her hand clutching Lena's as if the only thing tethering them to reality. The cold in the room was unbearable now, like they were standing in the frozen grip of something much older than time itself. What is it?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Lena opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but there was an oppressive weight in the air, a sense that it was getting closer with every second, even though its feet never seemed to touch the ground. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. It's not human." Sophie's grip tightened. "Then what is it?" Before Lena could answer, a low growl echoed through the basement, deep and guttural, like the growl of a beast that had been waiting for years to finally feast. The shadows around them seemed to shift, slithering and curling as if the darkness itself was alive, moving, circling them. Lena felt the air grow heavier, almost suffocating as the temperature dropped even further. And then the voice. It wasn't the figure's voice. It was something older. A whisper so faint, so cold, that it seemed to come from the very air around them. It slid into their ears like a serpent, coiling around their thoughts. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice slithered under their skin, its words sinking into their bones, sending a shiver of terror down their spines. Lena's mind raced. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here." But Sophie couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her wide eyes fixed on the figure in the corner, and Lena could see it now. Its body was shifting like it was not quite solid, its limbs distorting and twitching unnaturally. A distorted image of something once human. And then it spoke again. "You think you can run from me?" The voice was everywhere now, surrounding them, echoing off the walls, rattling the bones of the house. It was coming from the figure, from the mirror, from the very air itself. Lena's mind was spinning, the words of the voice seeping deeper into her consciousness, clouding her thoughts. But the worst part was the cold. It wasn't just the temperature of the room anymore. It was a gnawing, biting cold that seemed to come from inside her, like it was crawling through her veins, freezing her heart. Lena could feel it now, seeping into her chest, threatening to squeeze the breath from her lungs. "You belong to me now." The figure stepped forward, its feet scraping the floor like nails on a chalkboard. The shadows around it began to twist and contort, merging into something far more sinister, a shape that was not quite human. Lena's stomach turned and she instinctively took a step back, but Sophie held her tight. The growl grew louder. It was no longer just a sound, it was a vibration that shook the air itself. The walls creaked and the floorboards groaned under the weight of something unseen. Lena's eyes darted to the basement stairs. They were their only way out, but she could already feel the pressure of the house closing in on them. The whispers had become a chorus now, overlapping and jumbled, growing louder and louder, until they felt like a physical force against their ears. They couldn't escape it. They couldn't escape it. And then, as if in response to the rising terror, the mirror behind them, still hanging crookedly on the wall, began to ripple, its surface warping and bending, as if it were being pulled inward by an invisible force. Lena couldn't take her eyes off of it. The surface of the mirror seemed to undulate as if something was trying to push through. Something that didn't belong. Sophie shook Lena, her voice frantic. "Lena, we need to leave. Now." But Lena couldn't move. The mirror had her frozen in place. The whispers were now a constant hum in her ears, louder and louder, until they felt like 1,000 voices, all screaming at once. And then it happened. The figure lunged. Lena barely had time to scream as the creature, no longer even vaguely human, hurtled toward them with a speed that seemed impossible. It was a blur of shadow and malice, its glowing eyes fixed on them like a predator locking onto its prey. Its mouth stretched open impossibly wide, revealing sharp teeth like knives, dripping with some dark, viscous substance. Sophie screamed and pulled Lena back, but the creature was faster than either of them could react. Its cold hand shot out, grabbing Sophie by the arm, its grip like ice, crushing her flesh. Lena screamed, desperately trying to pull Sophie away, but the figure was too strong. "You can't escape. None of you will escape." The creature's voice was a distorted rasp now, its words filled with venom. It twisted Sophie's arm, sending a shock of pain through her, but Sophie managed to scream again, desperate for help. Yet there was no one to hear. Lena's eyes darted to the mirror, now completely distorted, the surface shimmering and warping like a black hole. A feeling of dread filled her chest. She knew what was happening. The mirror was a doorway, it had always been a doorway. And now the creature was pulling Sophie closer, dragging her toward the mirror. Lena couldn't let that happen. She couldn't lose Sophie. She didn't care about the creature, about the mirror, about the house. It was all too much, too terrifying. But there was one thing she knew. Sophie was her only friend. She wasn't going to let anything take her. With a surge of panic-fueled strength, Lena grabbed Sophie's other arm, pulling her with everything she had. She felt the creature's cold fingers slip from Sophie's arm, just for a moment as it hissed in frustration. Sophie stumbled backward and Lena pushed her toward the basement stairs. "We're going. We're getting out of here," Lena yelled, her voice raw. But as they made a desperate dash for the stairs, the creature lunged again, but this time, it didn't reach for Sophie. It reached for Lena. The moment the creature's icy fingers brushed her arm, the house groaned again, and the mirror shattered, sending glass flying everywhere, the sound deafening. But the figure wasn't gone. No, it was closer than ever, and it was angry. They couldn't run anymore. The darkness closed in. The air in the basement was thick with fear, suffocating their every breath. Lena's heart hammered in her chest, the sound pounding in her ears as she tried to pull Sophie toward the stairs. The shattered mirror sparkled like 1,000 broken promises on the floor, its pieces reflecting a distorted image of the chaos that had erupted around them. Lena could hear the low growl behind them, the sound of something moving, something waiting to strike. Her skin crawled, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end as she glanced over her shoulder. The figure was gone, but the sensation of its presence lingered in the air, a weight that pressed down on them from every direction. "We have to go now," Lena hissed, her voice frantic. "Hurry, Sophie." Sophie stumbled, clutching her arm where the creature had grabbed her, blood seeping through her fingers. I can't, it hurts so much." Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. Lena didn't stop. She couldn't. They had no time to waste, no time to think about the pain or the horror they had already endured. They needed to get out, now. She pulled Sophie up the stairs, the sound of her footsteps echoing like a warning in the silent house. Every time they took a step, the air seemed to grow heavier, colder, as though the house itself was closing in on them. But as they reached the top of the stairs, something stopped them cold. The front door, the one they had left wide open when they arrived, was now shut tight. Locked. Lena's eyes widened, a wave of panic crashing over her. The house, it wasn't just haunted, it was alive. She could feel it. The walls, the floors, even the windows, they were all alive, pressing in on them, trapping them, pulling them deeper into its endless darkness. What's happening? Why is the door locked? Sophie whimpered, her eyes wide with terror. Lena rushed to the door, pulling at the handle with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. She turned the knob again, harder this time, but it remained stubbornly closed. A soft whisper slid through the air, chilling her to the bone. "You can't leave." Lena froze, the blood draining from her face. She spun around, her eyes scanning the room in desperation. But there was no one. Only the shadows, thick and heavy, shifting in the corners of her vision. "Did you hear that?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a breath. Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I heard it. What is this place?" Lena shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "We can't stay here. We have to get out of here. Whatever it is, it wants us to stay." Sophie backed away from the door, her footsteps slow and careful, as if every movement was being watched. Lena followed, her eyes darting between the windows, the walls, the door. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving, something just out of her line of sight, lurking in the darkness, waiting. Suddenly, the lights flickered, their buzzing filling the silence like a warning. The room went dark for a split second, and in that moment, Lena heard something scraping against the walls like claws dragging across metal. When the lights flickered back on, Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The entire room had changed. The walls were no longer the familiar, comforting tan they had seen when they entered. Instead, they were covered in strange, jagged symbols, etched deep into the wood like scars. The air smelled musty, like rot, and there was a dampness that seemed to seep from every corner. The once familiar scent of the house was gone, replaced by something older, something foul. Lena took a step back. What is this?" But Sophie wasn't listening. She was staring at something in the corner of the room just beyond the stairs. Lena followed her gaze. A figure stood there. Not the creature, but something much worse. It was a woman. Or rather, it had been a woman once. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were empty sockets, black as midnight, but they stared straight into Lena's soul as if seeing her, judging her. Lena couldn't move. Her body was frozen, caught in the gaze of that empty stare. The woman's lips parted slowly, an unnatural smile stretching across her face, too wide, too wrong to be human. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was a rasp, a whisper that felt like it was coming from deep within Lena's mind. The woman's mouth didn't move as she spoke. Her voice was a part of the air, a part of the house. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the woman raised one of her bony hands and pointed directly at Sophie. The temperature in the room dropped, and Sophie gasped, her breath now visible in the air. Her body trembled as if something had seized her heart, and Lena could hear her soft, panicked breaths, the frantic beating of her pulse. "Sophie, no!" Lena cried, reaching for her, but Sophie didn't respond. She was frozen, staring into the woman's eyes, her mouth hanging open in terror, unable to look away. The woman began to move, slowly at first, dragging her feet across the floor as though each step was an eternity. With every step, the air grew thicker, heavier, the shadows growing deeper. The woman's figure warped as she moved, as if the house itself was warping her into something worse, something far more sinister. Lena felt herself stumbling backward, her heart pounding in her chest, her body desperate to flee. But she couldn't leave Sophie behind. She wouldn't leave her behind. "Sophie, please. Snap out of it." But Sophie didn't hear her. The woman's fingers were inches from Sophie's face now, the skin on her hand so pale, so translucent, it looked like paper. The woman's smile widened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Her breath was cold, like death itself. Lena reached out again, this time more forcefully, grabbing Sophie's wrist and pulling her back. The moment her fingers touched Sophie's skin, a shock of icy cold shot through her arm. It felt like the touch of death itself, a coldness that seeped into her bones, and Lena couldn't breathe. It was like the life was being drained from her. She pulled harder, yelling Sophie's name, trying to break through the trance. Finally, Sophie's eyes blinked, and she shook her head as if waking from a nightmare. But it was too late. The woman let out a high-pitched screech, a sound so sharp it cut through Lena's skull. The walls of the house seemed to pulse, as if the entire place was alive, alive with rage. Lena yanked Sophie toward the door once more, desperation rising in her chest. But just as she reached for the handle, the house shook. The floor beneath them groaned and cracked, like something deep within it was stirring, waking. And then the walls began to bleed. Sophie screamed. Lena screamed. And the house laughed. The house was no longer just a structure. It was a living, breathing thing, and it was tightening its grip around Lena and Sophie. The walls had bled, the floor had cracked beneath them, and the very air seemed to hum with a sinister energy. Each breath felt like it might be their last. Every step they took was met with resistance, as if the house itself didn't want them to leave. Sophie was shaking uncontrollably, her eyes wide with terror, her mind still struggling to process the horrors they had seen. Lena was equally shaken, but her survival instincts kicked in. They needed to get out. They had to escape before it was too late. "What is this place?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible above the ringing in their ears. "I don't know," Lena replied, her words laced with panic. "But we can't stay here." They moved cautiously through the hallway, each shadow in the corner of their vision seeming to grow larger, darker. The walls seemed to shift, the doorways narrowing with every passing second, trapping them further inside the house. It was as though the house was alive, shifting its shape, trapping them in a maze of dark corridors. The house seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like the slow beat of a heart, growing louder with each step they took. It was as if the very structure of the house was responding to their fear, feeding off their terror. Lena's eyes darted nervously as she pulled Sophie forward, but the sound of footsteps behind them froze her in place. "Did you hear that?" Sophie's voice trembled, her grip tightening on Lena's arm. Lena turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway was empty. There was nothing there. Yet the footsteps, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, following them, grew louder. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as though the house was pulling the warmth from their bodies. Lena couldn't take it anymore. "We need to find a way out, now." She grabbed Sophie's hand and yanked her toward the nearest door, a thick wooden one at the end of the hall. The handle was cold to the touch, like ice. She turned it, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark room beyond. The only sound was their frantic breathing and the echo of the footsteps, still approaching. Without a word, they stepped inside, closing the door behind them. The room was pitch black, the darkness so complete it felt suffocating. Lena fumbled for the light switch, her fingers brushing against the cold walls. Her hand finally found the switch and she flipped it, but the light didn't come on. "Come on," Lena muttered, panic creeping into her voice. "Please?" Nothing. The room remained shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering in through the cracks in the walls. "We're trapped," Sophie whispered, her voice full of dread. "No," Lena said firmly, though her voice betrayed her fear. "We can't be trapped. There has to be a way out. We just need to find it." But as she spoke, the air in the room began to change. The temperature dropped even further, the chill settling deep into their bones. And then there was a sound, a low growl, almost like a whisper, coming from somewhere deep within the room. Sophie gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "Lena, what is that?" Lena strained her ears, trying to locate the source of the sound, but the growl seemed to come from all directions at once, reverberating through the walls, the floor, and the very air around them. And then the whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. "You can't hide." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even close. It was low, guttural, filled with malice, like something ancient, something evil that had been lying dormant for centuries, waiting for them. The room seemed to close in on them, the walls pressing tighter, the shadows creeping closer, as though something was moving within the darkness, waiting to strike. Sophie grabbed Lena's arm, her grip tight with fear. "We need to leave. Now." But before Lena could respond, the door slammed shut behind them with a force that sent a shockwave through the room. The sound of the impact reverberated in their ears, making the very walls seem to shake. Lena's heart raced. She ran to the door and tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, sealed shut, as if the house itself had swallowed the key. "Lena, what's happening?" Sophie screamed, her voice cracking with fear. She backed away from the door, stumbling over her own feet. Lena turned around, her eyes searching the room, but there was nothing. Nothing except the darkness, closing in around them. The growl came again, this time followed by something worse. A scraping noise like nails against the wood, dragging slowly, deliberately, closer and closer. Sophie let out a strangled sob, clutching at Lena's arm. "We're not alone. Lena, oh, we're not alone." Lena's pulse raced as she scanned the room for an escape. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, writhing like they were alive. And then she saw it. A figure. It was standing in the far corner of the room, just outside the reach of the moonlight. The figure was tall, thin, its features hidden in the shadows. It didn't move, but Lena could feel its presence, could feel its eyes, cold, empty, watching them. Sophie gasped, her voice trembling. "Lena, look." Lena's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the figure. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet were rooted to the ground, her body frozen with fear. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Its face was hidden in shadow, but the faintest glimmer of light revealed something terrifying, its eyes. Two glowing, hollow orbs fixed on them, unblinking, unfeeling. The figure didn't speak. It didn't have to. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a terrible energy, a presence that filled the room, suffocating them both. Lena grabbed Sophie's hand, pulling her backward toward the corner of the room, her heart racing in her chest. She could feel the weight of the creature's gaze on them, could feel the darkness pressing down, pushing them into a corner. "Get away from it. Run," Lena screamed. But before they could move, the figure took a step forward, and the room plunged into complete darkness. Lena screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. And then, all at once, the room was filled with the sound of footsteps, countless footsteps, coming from every direction. The walls shook, the floor trembled, and then, the scream. The blood-curdling scream of a soul in agony, ripped from the depths of the earth. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as the house seemed to breathe around them, the walls groaning in protest. It wasn't just a house. It was a trap, a prison, and they were its prisoners. The darkness closed in on them, and all at once they were no longer alone. The darkness was suffocating. Every breath felt like an effort, each inhale more difficult than the last. Lena's eyes darted around, desperately trying to adjust to the impenetrable blackness that surrounded them. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was closing in on them. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, something ancient, something malevolent. Sophie's trembling hand gripped hers tighter, as if the mere act of holding on would keep them tethered to reality. But Lena knew that they weren't just fighting to survive the house. They were fighting to escape its grasp. There was a low growl, like a distant rumble from the depths of the earth, and the floor beneath them groaned as though it was alive. The walls seemed to move, shifting, contorting with every passing second. It was as though the house was changing its shape, remaking itself to trap them forever. And then they heard it, the whisper. "You can never leave." The voice was low, distorted, like it was coming from everywhere at once. It vibrated through the walls, sending chills down their spines. Lena could feel it in her bones, a wave of cold dread that seemed to settle deep inside her, chilling her to the core. The figure, the one they had seen in the corner of the room, was no longer just a shadow. It was real. It was standing right in front of them. Lena's heart raced as she stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. Sophie clung to her side, her wide eyes filled with terror. The figure stepped forward, its footsteps slow and deliberate, each one echoing through the darkness. Its form was still hidden in shadow, but the faintest hint of light revealed something far more horrifying than they could have imagined. Its eyes, those glowing, hollow orbs, cold and empty, seemed to pierce through the darkness, locking onto Lena and Sophie with a chilling intensity. It didn't move its lips, but Lena heard the voice again, louder this time. "You're mine now." The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing closer, the air growing heavier with each passing second. Lena felt as though the house itself was alive, breathing, feeding on their fear. Sophie's voice was a whisper, barely audible. "Lena, what is it? What is that thing?" Lena didn't know. She didn't have the answers. All she knew was that they couldn't let it get any closer. They couldn't let it claim them. Lena glanced frantically around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The door was still locked. The window was sealed tight, the glass too thick to break. They were trapped. And then the house groaned again, louder this time. The sound came from beneath their feet, vibrating through the floorboards, and Lena felt a sharp tug on her body, a force pulling her toward the center of the room. "No," Lena shouted, trying to break free. She pulled Sophie back, but the pull grew stronger, the force more insistent. It felt like the house was trying to swallow them whole. The figure took another step forward, its presence overwhelming. The coldness it exuded seemed to freeze the very air around them. Lena felt her muscles lock, her limbs refusing to obey as she fought against the unseen force. "It's too late," the figure whispered again, its voice dripping with malice. "You should have never come here." Lena's thoughts raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be something they could do to break free from the house's grip. And then she remembered something, the book. Earlier that night, when they had first arrived in the house, they had found an old, dusty tome hidden in a forgotten corner of the living room. The pages were yellowed with age, and the words written on them were strange, foreign even. But there was one passage that had stood out to her, one passage that described a ritual, something about banishing the darkness, about breaking the house's hold. She couldn't remember all of it, but she knew she had to act fast. Lena's mind raced, trying to recall the details. She could feel the house closing in on them, the presence of the entity growing stronger with every second. She had no time to waste. "Sophie," Lena said, her voice trembling but urgent. "We need to find the book. The ritual, it's our only chance." Sophie nodded frantically, her eyes wild with fear. "Where is it? Where did you see it?" Lena looked around the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't see the book. It was gone, vanished into thin air, just like the rest of the house's horrors. The walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm of their own, a constant hum that vibrated through their bones. Then she saw it, a shadow moving just beyond the reach of the dim light. The book. It was floating in midair, hovering just out of reach, its pages fluttering as if caught in an invisible wind. Lena's heart skipped a beat. The book was alive just like the house. With no time to waste, Lena reached out, her hand trembling as she grasped for the book. But as her fingers brushed against its cover, a shock of pain surged through her body. It was like an electric current, sharp and burning, sending waves of agony through her. She screamed, pulling her hand back, but the book remained just out of reach. The house was fighting back. The entity was holding them in place. Sophie pulled at her, trying to free her from the invisible bonds that held them together. But it was no use. The force was too strong. Lena looked up, her vision blurring with tears. She couldn't give up now. Not after everything they had been through. She couldn't let this thing win. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, its hollow eyes locked on Lena's face, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It was coming for them, its cold, skeletal hands reaching out, ready to claim them both. But Lena's instincts took over. She reached out again, this time with all her strength, and grabbed the book. As soon as her fingers closed around it, a surge of energy ripped through her, a blinding light engulfing the room. The entity screamed, its form distorting, twisting in agony as the house itself began to shake violently. The walls cracked. The floor buckled. The air was filled with a deafening roar. And then everything went silent. Lena gasped for air, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked around. The darkness had lifted. The room was normal again, calm, still as if nothing had happened. Sophie stood beside her, her eyes wide with disbelief. Lena, did we do it? Lena didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was reeling, her body trembling with exhaustion. But one thing was clear, the entity was gone. The house was quiet now. Too quiet. But the question lingered. Would they ever truly escape? Would the house ever let them go? As Lena and Sophie stumbled out into the hallway, they could feel it. Something was still watching them, waiting for them to let their guard down. The terror wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The door to the outside was just ahead, but as they reached it, Lena's eyes narrowed. She felt something cold against her neck. A presence. They had won for now, but they would never be free.